The restaurant went quiet the moment she looked up from her menu. Not the whole restaurant, just our corner of it. The private dining room my husband had reserved for what he called a team celebration dinner. 12 people seated around a long mahogany table. Crystal wine glasses. White linen. The kind of place where they bring the bread warm, and the check never has prices printed on it. I had arrived 3 minutes late, because my flight from Quantico landed 40 minutes behind schedule. I'd changed in an airport bathroom, traded my dress uniform for a navy blazer and black trousers, and taken a rideshare directly to the restaurant without stopping at home first. My husband, Gregory, was at the head of the table. The woman sitting 2 seats to his left was not his colleague. I understood that the moment she smiled at him. A particular kind of smile that people try to make look casual when it is anything but. She was younger than me. Mid-30s, I guessed. Dark hair pinned back. A silk dress the color of champagne. She was laughing at something Gregory had just said, touching his arm briefly, the way you touch someone you know well. Gregory saw me walk in. For a fraction of a second, less than a heartbeat, something moved across his face. Not guilt. Not even surprise. Something closer to calculation. The look a man gets when he's deciding which version of the truth to offer. Then he stood, opened his arms, and smiled. Rebecca, you made it. He kissed my cheek. Everyone, this is my wife Rebecca. There were nods around the table. Polite smiles. Someone raised a glass. Then the woman in the champagne dress looked directly at me. Her face changed completely. She went pale first. Then something else moved through her expression. Recognition. A particular, specific recognition. Not the kind you feel when you've seen someone before at a party or a restaurant. The kind you feel when you have reason to remember someone's face. A reason you'd rather forget. She stood so quickly her chair scraped the floor. General Carter, she said. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. The table went silent. Every head turned, first toward her, then toward me. Gregory blinked. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. I'm sorry, he said, looking between us. Do you too? How do you know each other? I picked up a menu from the empty seat beside me, settled into the chair, and looked across the table at the woman who had apparently forgotten that people like me tend to remember every face in every courtroom. We've met before, I said calmly. Haven't we, Lieutenant? To understand what happened at that dinner table, you have to understand what happened before. Not last week. Not even last year. You have to go back 26 years, to a base in southeastern Virginia, to a 23-year-old woman standing in the rain outside a recruitment office, deciding whether to walk through the door. My name is Rebecca Carter. I am 51 years old. And for most of the years of my marriage, I was invisible inside my own home. Not because I was quiet, but because I was gone. That distinction matters. I grew up in a small city in North Carolina, the second of 3 daughters born to a high school principal and a registered nurse. We weren't wealthy, but there was structure, discipline, expectation. My mother used to say that character was built in the spaces between what you wanted and what you chose. I didn't understand that when I was 12. I understand it completely now. I was accepted to the Naval Academy at Annapolis in 1994. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday. My father read it twice, set it down on the kitchen table, and shook my hand like I was already someone worth knowing. My mother stood at the counter for a long moment with her back to us. When she turned around, her eyes were wet. You're going to be extraordinary, she said. Just promise me you'll be kind. I promised. I've tried to keep that promise. Even on the nights when kindness felt like the hardest possible option. The academy was difficult in ways I hadn't anticipated. Not the physical difficulty. I had prepared for that. The social architecture was what surprised me. The hierarchies. The unspoken rules. The 1,000 small moments where you are measured, assessed, and filed into a category before you've had the chance to explain yourself. I learned early that the fastest way to change someone's category for you was to do the work so thoroughly that the category became irrelevant. I graduated near the top of my class in 1998. I was commissioned as an ensign. Over the following years, I moved through the ranks with the kind of deliberate focus that my commanding officers called rare, and my colleagues sometimes called less charitably, relentless. I didn't mind. Relentless was better than invisible. I met Gregory in 2001. He was a civilian contractor working on a base near Norfolk. Structural engineering. Dark hair, easy laugh. The kind of man who made every room feel more relaxed just by walking into it. We met at a birthday dinner for a mutual friend. A fellow officer named Sandra who had the worst taste in restaurants and the best taste in people. Gregory sat across from me all evening, asked me questions instead of talking about himself, and then at the end of the night said, simply, "I'd like to take you to dinner somewhere better than this." I said yes. I don't think I hesitated. We married in 2003. I was 28. He was 32. The ceremony was small. Family, close friends, a reception in his parents' backyard because I was being deployed 3 weeks later, and there wasn't time to plan anything elaborate. I remember standing in front of the officiant thinking that this was the only time in my life I had walked into something without a detailed plan, and being surprised that I wasn't afraid. For the first several years, the marriage worked the way a strong marriage should. Gregory built his consulting business. I moved through deployments, assignments, and promotions. We were apart more than we were together. That was the reality of my career. But when we were together, it felt like coming home. He knew how to give me space without making space feel like distance. That's rarer than people think. The children came in 2005 and 2008. 2 sons, Daniel and Marcus. Both of them with their father's laugh and, mercifully, a little of their mother's stubbornness. Raising them across military postings, with Gregory holding the household together during my absences, was not easy. I won't pretend it was. There were nights I called home from overseas and could hear something careful in Gregory's voice, a particular flatness that told me he was exhausted and choosing not to say so. I noticed. I was simply too far away, too often, to fix it. That's a thing about this life that nobody tells you cleanly. The career you build in service to something larger than yourself will cost you, and the currency it takes most steadily is presence. I miss school plays, baseball games, a broken arm, a suspended driver's license, 2 graduations. I miss the 1,000 ordinary Tuesdays that turn out, in retrospect, to be the actual substance of a family. Gregory never complained. Not in words. But something shifted, somewhere around 2017. I noticed it first in the quality of his silences, then in the way he answered questions, short, complete, closed, then in small calendar anomalies I'd catch during brief stretches at home. Dinner plans he hadn't mentioned, a weekend conference I didn't recall him referencing. I am, professionally, a woman trained to read evidence. What I found in those silences and calendar gaps was evidence I didn't want to read. I told myself I was misreading it. I was not misreading it. I want to be precise about something here. The pain of betrayal in a long marriage is not simple. People on the outside imagine it as clean, one sharp cut, then anger, then healing. What it actually is slow and heavy, like water filling a building from the inside. You notice the first inch and think, I can manage this. By the time the water is at your waist, you've been managing so long that you can barely remember when it started. What I haven't told you yet is what I do. I am a Judge Advocate General, a JAG officer. I have spent the last 19 years of my military career as a prosecutor, not a litigator in the civilian sense. A military prosecutor, working cases that the general public rarely hears about. Fraud, misconduct, crimes committed within the chain of command. I have tried cases in courts martial on 3 continents. I have prosecuted officers of higher rank than myself, in rooms full of people who wanted me to fail. And I have never once lost the thread of a case because I allowed personal feeling to override professional judgment. That capacity, the ability to remain precise when everything inside you is screaming, did not come naturally. It was built over 2 decades, case by case, decision by decision. I had just been promoted to the rank of Brigadier General 3 months before the dinner. The promotion had been finalized in a quiet ceremony at the Pentagon, attended by my commanding officer, 2 members of my staff, and nobody from my family because Gregory had a conflict and the boys were too far away. I didn't mind. I had long since made peace with celebrating alone. What I had not yet decided was what to do about my marriage. I had known, with reasonable certainty, for approximately 14 months that Gregory was involved with someone. I knew this the way I know most things. Not from a dramatic discovery, not from a confrontation, but from the accumulation of small inconsistencies that, read together, formed a pattern too coherent to dismiss. A pattern of absence. A pattern of separate. I had not yet confronted him because I am, by training and by nature, someone who does not move until she understands the full picture. I had spent 14 months quietly assembling the picture. I was nearly finished. The dinner invitation had come from Gregory 2 weeks earlier. Company celebration, he said. New contract with the Defense Department. I want you there. You've been away so much. I want everyone to meet you. I'd accepted. It seemed on the surface like something worth attending. My husband, wanting to show me to his colleagues. A public acknowledgement. A sign maybe that the distance I'd sensed could be repaired. What I had not known, could not have known, was who would be sitting 2 seats to his left. Her name was Lieutenant Diane Marsh. I had prosecuted her court-martial case 4 years earlier. I need to be precise here, because the details matter. In 2020, I was assigned as lead prosecutor in a case involving financial misconduct within a contracting unit station near Quantico. 3 officers were charged. The case was not particularly complex by JAG standards. The evidence was thorough, the paper trail was clear, but one of the defendants, a junior officer named Diane Marsh, had retained civilian counsel who fought the case with an aggressiveness that I had rarely seen at that level of proceeding. I won the case. All 3 officers were found guilty on the primary charges. Lieutenant Marsh received a reprimand, a fine, and a reduction in rank that was subsequently suspended pending appeal. The appeal failed. She left the military shortly afterward. A voluntary separation that, given the circumstances, was almost certainly not voluntary. I remembered her face because I remember all of them. That is what prosecutors do. We carry the faces of the people we have held accountable, not out of cruelty, but because accountability is only meaningful if the person dispensing it understands its weight. What I had not known, until the moment she looked up from her menu at that mahogany table, was that Diane Marsh was the woman my husband had been seeing for the past 14 months. I understood it the instant I saw her face change. I understood it completely. And so I sat down, picked up the menu, and waited. What happened next told me everything I needed to know about both of them. Gregory composed himself quickly. That had always been one of his most effective qualities. The ability to find the social footing in a room very fast. He introduced the other guests around the table, kept his voice easy and warm, poured wine, and watched me the way a man watches a door he isn't sure will stay closed. Diane Marsh sat very still. She had stopped touching Gregory's arm. She had placed both hands flat on the table in front of her, and her expression had settled into something carefully neutral. The look of a person doing rapid calculation about how much someone else knows and what it means. A man named Thomas, Gregory's business partner, leaned toward me and extended his hand. Rebecca, we've heard so much about you. Gregory talks about your work all the time. Does he? I said pleasantly. That's kind. Remarkable career. 20+ years of service. Recently promoted, he tells us. That's right. What is it you do exactly? In the JAG Corps? I heard Diane Marsh draw in a quiet breath. Prosecution mostly, I said. I didn't look at her when I said it. I try cases. Military law. Criminal matters within the armed forces. Thomas nodded appreciatively. So you're a lawyer? Among other things, I said. The evening continued. For almost 2 hours. I ate the sea base. I drank 1 glass of Bordeaux. I spoke with Thomas about the new defense contract, with a woman named Claire about her daughter's gap year in Portugal, with a quiet man on my right named James who turned out to be an architect from Georgia with a lovely dry sense of humor. I was, by every observable measure, a perfectly gracious guest. Gregory visibly relaxed by the end of the first hour. He began to breathe more easily, to speak more freely. He told 2 stories I had heard before and laughed at both of them. At one point he caught my eye from across the table and smiled. A real smile. Relieved and almost warm. And I smiled back. Diane Marsh barely spoke for the entire meal. She excused herself at 9:15. Early morning, she told the table. Wonderful evening. She shook hands around the table without meeting my eyes once, and was gone before the dessert menus arrived. Gregory watched the door close behind her. Then he looked at me. "Did you enjoy yourself?" he asked carefully. "Very much," I said. I folded my napkin. "She seems nervous." A pause. Brief but precise. "Who does?" "Diane," I said. "She barely touched her dinner." Gregory said nothing. "Did you know," I said pleasantly, reaching for my water glass, "that there's a standing regulation in JAG that requires disclosure when a prosecutor becomes aware of a conflict of interest?" He stared at me. "I'm not a prosecutor tonight, of course," I said. "Tonight I'm just your wife. But I thought it was an interesting coincidence, Gregory. The woman sitting 2 seats from you. I tried her case 4 years ago." The color left his face slowly, the way tide goes out, gradually, then all at once. "Rebecca." "I'm not going to make a scene," I said. My voice was perfectly steady. "I won't embarrass you in front of Thomas and Claire and James. That's not who I am. But I want you to listen to me very carefully." He was listening. "I know," I said simply. "I've known for a while. And now that I've seen her, I know everything I needed to know. So what happens next is a conversation we will have at home. Not tonight. Tonight you will finish your dessert, thank your colleagues, and take a cab home because I'll be taking the car." I picked up my purse. "Dinner was excellent," I said. "The sea base particularly." And I walked out. I drove home through the dark streets of Northern Virginia with the radio off, and both hands on the wheel. There is a particular quality to clarity when it finally arrives after a long period of uncertainty. It isn't relief, exactly. It's more like the moment you come out of dense fog onto open road. Not that everything ahead is easy, but that you can see it now, and seeing is its own kind of power. I had spent 14 months in the fog. I was done with it. Our house was a 4-bedroom colonial in Arlington. We'd bought it in 2009. I had been deployed within 6 weeks of the closing, and had never been fully certain I deserved to call it home, given how rarely I was there. My sons had grown up in that house, Daniel's basketball hoop in the driveway, Marcus's telescope still set up in the upstairs guest room, pointed at a window that faced east. I sat in the kitchen for an hour before Gregory came home. He walked in at 11:45. He stood in the kitchen doorway in his good dinner jacket, and looked at me with the face of a man who has driven home rehearsing a conversation, and arrived to find it doesn't match any of his prepared versions. "Sit down," I said. He sat. "How long?" I asked. He looked at the table. "Rebecca." "How long, Gregory?" A long pause. "About 1.5 years," he said. 14 months. I had been off by 2 months. "Did you know who she was?" I asked. "Before, did you know she'd had a case before a JAG court?" He shook his head slowly. "She told me 6 months in, after she left the service." "Did she tell you who prosecuted her?" A pause. "No, she didn't know," I said almost to myself. "She wouldn't have recognized me at dinner if she'd known. She'd have been prepared." I considered that. She knew there was a Mrs. Carter. She just never connected the name. Gregory looked up. There was something terrible in his expression. Not the guilt of a man caught, but the grief of a man who has destroyed something he didn't fully value until this moment. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know you are," I said. "That's not the same as it being enough." We talked until 2 a.m, not with raised voices, not with broken things. I have spent too many years in rooms where the alternative to precision is catastrophe to allow myself the luxury of losing control when it matters most. I asked the questions I needed answered. I listened to the answers. I noted what was honest and what was performance. Most of it, that night, was honest. I learned that Gregory had met Diane Marsh at a contracting conference, that she had known he was married, that what had begun as a professional acquaintance had shifted over months into something he described, painfully, as something I didn't expect. I did not ask him to define that further. It wasn't what I needed to know. What I needed to know was whether our marriage, stripped down to what remained beneath the betrayal, contained anything worth rebuilding. I didn't have the answer that night. I wasn't sure I would have it for a while. I went back to Quantico the following Monday. I am a person who processes things through work. This is a flaw, probably, in certain seasons of life. It was not a flaw that Monday. I walked into my office, sat down behind a desk covered in case files, and spent 3 days doing the most precise, focused work of my career, because precision was the only thing that felt clean. My assistant, a sharp young officer named Captain Ellison, placed a coffee on my desk the first morning, and looked at me with the carefully neutral expression of someone who can read a room. "How was leave, General?" "Educational," I said. "Understood, Mom." He went back to his desk without asking a single follow-up question. I have promoted people for less. What I did during those days at Quantico was not just casework. I also, quietly and methodically, began to understand the full picture of what my marriage had become. This is the part nobody tells you about being married to someone who drifts away slowly. The picture assembles itself piece by piece, and each piece carries its own small weight, and eventually the picture is complete, and what it shows is not a villain and a victim, but two people who stopped tending to each other across too many years of absence and competing demands, until the garden they built together grew over with silence. I am not absolving Gregory. What he did was a choice, and choices carry consequences. He could have come to me 2 years earlier and said, "I am lonely. I am struggling. I am afraid the distance has cost us something we can't get back." That conversation would have been hard. I would have listened. We might have found our way. He didn't have that conversation. Instead, he found Diane Marsh. And I had spent 14 months carrying a weight I didn't name until it sat down across from me at a restaurant wearing a champagne dress. By Thursday, I had made 3 decisions. The first was to retain a divorce attorney, not because the marriage was certainly over, but because I needed independent counsel, someone whose sole obligation was to understand and protect what I had built over 26 years of work. That was not a decision made in anger. It was a decision made in clarity. The second was to call my sons. Daniel was 20 in 2024, a junior at the University of Virginia. Marcus was 17, a senior in high school. I called Daniel first because he was older, and because he had, in the careful way of eldest children, been aware for longer than I would have liked that something was wrong at home. "Mom," he said, when I'd finished explaining, with as much gentleness as the facts permitted. "Yes." "Are you okay?" "I'm functional," I said. "I'm going to be fine. I need you to know that before I tell you anything else. Your mother has been through harder rooms than this." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know, Mom. I know you have." I called Marcus an hour later. He was quieter than Daniel, more like me in certain ways. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and at the end he said, "Does he know how lucky he was? Does he understand what he had?" I didn't have a clean answer to that. "He's beginning to," I said. The third decision took me 2 more weeks to make, and it surprised me when I made it. Diane Marsh worked in the private sector now. Consulting, as it turned out. An irony that landed somewhere between painful and absurd, given that she had met Gregory at a contracting conference and that he himself ran a consulting firm. There is something almost geometric about the way certain mistakes arrange themselves. I knew where she worked because I had found, over the course of my career, that knowing things is always better than not knowing them, even when the things are uncomfortable. I went to her office on a Thursday afternoon 4 weeks after the dinner, not to confront her, not to threaten her. I want to be precise about this, because the impulse people imagine in a scene like that one is always the wrong one. I did not go because I wanted to see her frightened. I did not go because I wanted her to know what I was capable of professionally. I did not go for any version of revenge. I went because I needed to understand one thing that I could not understand without looking at her directly. Did she know, when she became involved with my husband, the full cost of what she was doing? Not the professional cost. She had already paid that, in a different court, for different choices. The human cost. The cost to a family. The cost to 2 sons. The cost to a woman who was deployed when the garden started dying, and didn't know how bad it had gotten until she came home. Her office was on the 4th floor of a glass building near Tyson's Corner. A reception desk, a waiting area, the quiet ambient noise of a small consulting company doing careful, organized work. She came out to the reception area herself. Someone must have told her I was there. She looked smaller than she had at the restaurant. People often do, when you meet them outside the drama of a charged room. She was in business casual, a gray blazer, dark trousers, and she looked like she hadn't been sleeping well. "General Carter," she said. "You don't need to call me that," I said. "Not today." We went to a conference room. 2 chairs, a small table, a view of the parking structure outside. I've had harder conversations in more difficult rooms. I asked her the question directly. "I need to understand something," I said. "When you became involved with my husband, did you think about the family?" She looked at the table for a long moment. "I told myself it was complicated," she said finally. "I told myself marriages that were already broken weren't really. That people moved on, and I wasn't the cause, I was just." She stopped. "Those are things you tell yourself," she said quietly. "They're not things that hold up when you're sitting across from someone." "No," I said. "They don't." "I didn't know who you were," she said. "I knew his wife existed. I knew she was in the military. I didn't know," she stopped. "When you walked into that restaurant, I recognized you before I'd consciously placed you. My body remembered before my mind did." She looked up. "The way you stood. The way you moved into a room. I'd spent 3 weeks watching you move through a courtroom." She shook her head slightly. "I felt sick." "Good," I said. Not harshly. Simply. She nodded. "Does it change anything?" I asked. "Knowing who I am. Knowing what your choices cost." A long pause. "It doesn't change what happened," she said. "I know that. But," she pressed her lips together, "I think about your sons. I have. Since that night at the restaurant, I think about them more than anything else." That surprised me. I didn't show it. "They're remarkable young men," I said. "I know," she said. "Gregory talked about them. He loves them very much." "He does," I said. That part was never in question. I stood up. She looked up at me with an expression I recognized, not from our courtroom, but from years of watching defendants understand the moment of accountability, that particular stillness when a person stops running from the weight of a thing and feels it fully, possibly for the first time. "I'm not going to do anything to you professionally," I said. "I want to be clear about that. What happened between you and Gregory was wrong, and it hurt people I love, but the case I tried against you 4 years ago stands on its own. This has nothing to do with that." She released a breath slowly. "What I am going to ask," I said, "is that whatever you had with my husband is finished. Completely. Not because I've necessarily decided to rebuild the marriage. I haven't decided that yet. But because my sons deserve a period of quiet. They deserve their father's full attention during whatever comes next. Can you give them that?" She looked at me steadily. "Yes," she said. "Thank you," I said. And I walked out. The divorce attorney I hired was a woman named Patricia Hollis who had been practicing family law in Virginia for 32 years and who reminded me, in small ways, of my mother. The same calm precision, the same refusal to dramatize things that didn't need dramatizing. She reviewed the situation over 2 consultations, and then told me something I hadn't expected. "You have a strong case," she said. "You have grounds, you have assets, you have a career that means your financial independence isn't in question. Legally, this is not complicated." "But," I said. She looked at me. "There's no but legally. I'm just noting that the legal picture and the personal one are often different. You'll know what you want when you've had enough time to be quiet about it." I appreciated her enormously for that. I requested extended assignment in Northern Virginia, which my commanding officer granted with no questions asked, and a look that told me he understood something personal was in motion. The military is better at extending grace to human difficulty than its reputation suggests, particularly for officers who have given it a significant portion of their lives. Gregory and I did not immediately separate. We occupied the house like 2 careful guests, considerate, quiet, aware of each other's boundaries in a way that we had perhaps never been during the easier years. It was strange and sad and occasionally, in small moments, unexpectedly tender. He was trying. I could see it clearly. The effort was real. It had the quality of a man who had made a serious mistake and was no longer hiding from the dimensions of it. One evening in November, 3 months after the dinner, He knocked on the door of the study where I was working. "Can I come in?" "Of course." He sat in the reading chair by the window. For a while he just looked at the yard, which was bare and gray in the November dark. Then he said, "I've been trying to figure out what to say to you that isn't an apology. Because I've said the apology and I know that's not what fixes it." "No," I said. "It's not." "What I keep coming back to," he said, "is something Daniel said to me. He said, 'You have to figure out what you owe her, Dad.' Not as a husband who made a mistake. As a person who shared a life with another person." I looked at him. "That's a wise thing for a 20-year-old to say," I said. "He's more like you than you know." We sat quietly for a while. Outside, a car moved slowly down the street, its headlights tracing across the ceiling. "I don't know what we are yet," I said finally. "I don't know if we're people who rebuild or people who part with dignity. I need more time." "I know," he said. "What I need from you while I'm deciding," I said, "is honesty. Complete honesty. Not managed honesty. Not the kind designed to give me the best picture of you. The actual truth about who you became while I was away, and why." "That's a hard conversation," he said quietly. "Gregory," I said, "I've tried generals in closed courts-martial. I once cross-examined a man who had the Secretary of Defense waiting outside. I can handle a hard conversation." For the first time in a very long time he laughed. A real laugh. Brief but genuine. "I know," he said. "I know you can. I will not tell you that everything resolved cleanly. It didn't. Life rarely assembles itself that way for people willing to look at it honestly. Gregory and I spent 4 months in what I came to think of as the excavation. A careful, painful, honest process of understanding what had happened to our marriage across 26 years. We worked with a couples counselor named Dr. Renata Singh, who had the extraordinary gift of asking exactly the right question, and then going completely quiet while you found the answer. In those sessions, I learned things that surprised me. I learned that Gregory had felt invisible in our marriage too. Not excluded, not unwanted, but gradually erased by the sheer force of my absence. That the identity he had built as the person who kept the household, raised the children, managed the domestic architecture of 2 decades, that identity had felt, to him, like the invisible work that keeps a machine running without anyone thanking the mechanism. I had not known he felt that way. I should have asked. That is the hardest thing I've had to sit with. Not Gregory's betrayal. That is his to carry. My own blind spot. The way I had assumed that because he never complained, everything was adequate. That because he said he was fine, fine was the full picture. I am a prosecutor. I am trained to look for what isn't being said. And in my own home, across 26 years, I had failed to apply that skill to the most important relationship of my life. That failure is mine. I own it. By spring, Gregory had ended all contact with Diane Marsh. Not because I demanded it. The demand, I had made clear, was a condition of any ongoing conversation, not a negotiation, but because he had come, in the excavation, to understand that what he had sought in that relationship was not something she could actually give him. The thing he had been missing was not a person. It was a kind of acknowledgement, a kind of being seen. And a person who had met him in the context of his own loneliness was not a person who could solve the loneliness's source. He told me this in a session with Dr. Singh in February. She looked at me after he finished. "Rebecca," she said, "I thought about what I wanted to say. About how many times I'd come home from a deployment and found Gregory in the kitchen at 11 at night, working, and had asked, 'How was the day?' and moved on when he said, 'Fine.' About the career I had built with such focus that I had sometimes treated my own marriage as a logistical matter rather than a living thing requiring daily tending. I think," I said slowly, "that we have spent 26 years being 2 very capable people who forgot to be one household." Gregory looked at me. "That's the most honest thing you've said in here," Dr. Singh said quietly. It probably was. In April, I sat in the kitchen on a Sunday morning with 2 cups of coffee and Gregory across the table, and I told him what I had decided. He sat very still. "I don't know if we can rebuild what we had," I said. "I'm not sure we should rebuild exactly that. What we had contained too many years of silent accumulation to be the blueprint for what comes next." I held my cup. "But I think, if you are willing to do the hard work, honestly, for as long as it takes. I am willing to find out what we could become instead. Something more honest. Something less managed. Something that requires both of us to be fully present in a way we never quite were before. He was quiet for a long time. You'd be willing to try? He said. I'm already trying, I said. I've been in Dr. Singh's office for 4 months trying. What I'm asking is whether you understand what trying actually costs. Not just the sessions. Not just the promises. The daily work of actually seeing another person. The work of staying visible to someone instead of shrinking into manageability. I understand, he said. Gregory. I set my cup down. If it happens again, in any form, I will leave. And I will leave with the full resources of 26 years of military service and an extremely good attorney. You understand that? I understand that, he said. Then we'll try, I said. He reached across the table. I let him take my hand. 6 months after the dinner at that restaurant, I stood before a graduating class of JAG officers at Quantico and gave the remarks I'd been asked to give on the subject of integrity. I had rewritten those remarks 6 times. The version I delivered was the 7th. It was the one that included something I hadn't planned to include, but which felt on the morning of the ceremony like the most important thing I could offer 23 young officers standing at the beginning of their careers. I told them this. In military law, we talk constantly about the burden of proof, the standard you must meet before you can hold someone accountable. We train you to understand evidence, to identify patterns, to never mistake what is plausible for what is proven. I paused. What we don't train you for well enough is this. The same rigor you apply to your cases must, at some point, be turned inward. On your choices. On your absences. On the people you love and have perhaps forgotten to actually look at, because you were so busy looking at everything else. The auditorium was very quiet. Character, I said, is not what you do in the courtroom. It is what you do at the kitchen table, at 11 at night, when no one is watching and nothing is on the record. It is whether you ask the real question instead of the comfortable one. It is whether you stay in a hard conversation instead of managing it into silence. I looked out at those young faces. You will be asked in this career to hold people accountable for their failures. I want you to remember that accountability is only meaningful if the person dispensing it has held themselves to the same standard. And I want you to remember that forgiveness, not absolution, but genuine forgiveness, is one of the most precise instruments available to us. It does not mean what happened didn't matter. It means you have chosen not to let it be the last word. After the ceremony, a young officer, a woman, perhaps 24 years old, the beginning of everything still ahead of her, came to me with the tentative confidence of someone working up to a question. General Carter, she said. The part about the kitchen table, was that from experience? I looked at her. Most of the best things I know, I said, came from something that cost me. She nodded slowly, absorbing that. Thank you, ma'am, she said. I watched her go. Straight-backed, purposeful, already moving toward whatever would define her. I thought about my mother, standing at the kitchen counter 30 years ago with wet eyes and a letter in my father's hand. You're going to be extraordinary. Just promise me you'll be kind. I had promised. I was still keeping it. Even now. Especially now. Because the truth about the long marriages, the long careers, the long seasons of absence and difficult return, is this. The people who endure are not the ones who were never broken. They are the ones who learned in the breaking what they were actually made of. And they were made of something that lasts longer than the wound. Something that turns out, in the end, to be enough.